Everybody. Thanks for coming to the CPEP seminar this afternoon. Obviously, we have an online version of this today, so thank you for joining us online, and there may be some more people joining as well. We're very happy and excited to have Yarrow Axford here today presenting. And I am going to turn it over to Jeremy Brooks, who has worked with Yarrow somewhat to give the introduction today's talk. And then per our usual, I guess, if we'll have Yarrow you present, and then we'll reserve some time at the end for questions and answers. So thanks so much for being here, and glad that that you're here. We're looking forward to the talk.
Thank you.
Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Brooks. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Geoscience. But before that, I was an undergraduate researcher with Yarrow. So I just wanted to introduce her and just welcome her to give this talk. So Yarrow is a professor at Northwestern University, where she studies Holocene paleoclimate in particular, especially focused on Arctic regions. And typically she uses lake sediments to study climate and paleoclimate. So she'll go to different lakes throughout the Arctic and also expanding into the Midwest and Northeast US, collect these cores of lake sediments, and then measure a variety of proxies to understand past climate. And for this talk, she's going to tell us about climate lessons from a warmer Greenland. So let's welcome Yarrow. Looking forward to this talk.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. And I think, every professor here would agree that it's just the nicest thing in the world to see students we've worked with go on to bigger and better things. And it's wonderful that Jeremy's up there in Madison with you all. I wish I were today, but I just got out of the classroom teaching Quaternary paleoclimate. So thank you so much for joining me on Zoom as an alternative. And Jeremy teed things up nicely. I'm going to talk to you today about the use of lake sediments to look at a warmer time period in Greenland's quite recent geologic past and try to draw some lessons from these geologic records that might be relevant to warming that's going to happen in Greenland's future. So it's quite widely known that the Arctic is the fastest warming part of our planet today. But even though I look at data related to this on a daily basis, the numbers just always kind of stun me. So this is one way to look at recent warming. We are seeing temperature anomalies of the last decade compared with just the mid-20th century by latitude. And what's happening in the Arctic shows up very clearly. It's just a really, really rapid change happening in the northern part of our planet. And it's become quite urgent to understand how this warming is affecting and in the future will affect Greenland's environment. That is largely because about 7 meters of sea level equivalent sits on top of Greenland in the form of the Greenland ice sheet. But there are other reasons to be concerned with how Greenland responds to warming. And a lot of them have to do with the local impacts of this really rapid warming. So oftentimes when scientists like me present work from the Arctic, we show these slides of our very remote study sites, and you can get the impression that the Arctic is this vast unpopulated area. But in reality, about 4 million people live in the Arctic worldwide. And about 56,000 people live in Greenland, and the vast majority of them are indigenous Greenlandic people who now are finding that the knowledge they are inheriting from parents and grandparents about the environment is becoming less and less relevant to the modern day environment as it changes so rapidly. So climate change is threatening a lot of aspects of livelihood for the people who live in Greenland. So I want to, in my acknowledgements today, first and foremost, acknowledge the people in Greenland who have allowed scientists from abroad to visit and study and sample their homelands for a long time. And then I also want to acknowledge NSF. That's provided the vast majority of funding for the research I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to give kind of a high-level overview of a range of work that we've done that's happened over more than a decade and has involved a large number of PhD students as well as undergrads, and there's Jeremy Brooks there on that list, and a bunch of collaborators, many of whom are glacial geologists or paleoceanographers, or like me, paleoecologists. So just thank you to all of these people, and I will mention a few grad students in particular whose work I'll show today when we get to that. So as Jeremy mentioned, I'm going to talk about the use of lake sediments, like these ones, to reconstruct paleoclimate and paleo-environmental change over mostly the last 10,000 years, the Holocene. Why go to so much trouble to travel to sometimes extremely remote sites to get out onto these lakes and basically shove a sewer pipe down into the bottom of them and pull out a sediment record? Or to put it another way, why care about paleoclimate in Greenland in this time when it is so urgent to understand present day and future climate change here? Well, one reason is that we really need quantitative constraints on things like temperature and precipitation rates to compare with climate model simulations and to test climate models. If our best-in-class climate models cannot successfully simulate what happened with climate in the Holocene, when we know boundary conditions and we know forcings quite well, then we know there's probably some issues with our models, but we need really good reconstructions for comparisons to do those kinds of tests. And we also would love to know more about how a warming climate affects ice sheets. This is science that has advanced tremendously in the last decade or two, but nonetheless, we still have really big uncertainties, especially on the timescale of ice sheet response to warming, and therefore how rapid sea level rise is likely to be in the future. So just like with climate models, we need sort of empirically derived descriptions of real configurations of ice sheets and climate that existed in the past, real changes in ice sheets that were driven by climate change in the past to use to test ice sheet models, which are still very much a work in progress, it's ice sheet models. And then, so I'll talk about temperature reconstructions for the first part of my talk today, and that's actually something I've devoted a lot of the last decade to, is reconstructing temperature in degrees C through the Holocene over Greenland. But I'll go quickly through that because I want to get to the stuff that's really interesting me now, which is more about how that warming actually affects the environment of the Arctic and of Greenland. So we can use paleoclimate to ask questions like, when Greenland warms, did glaciers disappear? Did wildfires occur in places where maybe they don't today? Did lakes that are used as water supplies for communities now, did they dry up? And did carbon cycle feedbacks kick in? And we can also ask, how much warming did it take to make any of those changes happen? So my group is working on all those questions right now. And I'm going to talk today about the first, about glaciers, and the last a bit about carbon cycling. But I wanted to give everybody a little quick background on the Holocene in Greenland, and much of what I'm going to say applies to the Arctic as a whole as well, just so you have a foundation for the rest of the talk. So this figure is showing you the last 11,000 years of Earth's history, going from right to left, and unfortunately, I'm going to show you figures that go in different directions. Time goes in different directions, but if you've watched any paleoclimate talks, you've dealt with that before. The dominant forcing of change in climate over the Arctic through the Holocene is the red curve that you see here, which is depicting summer insolation, so summer receipts of solar radiation over the high northern latitudes. And that long, slow decline through the Holocene drove a long, slow cooling. In other words, there's a lot of evidence that the early part of the Holocene was warmer than the pre-industrial late Holocene, or warmer than the mid-20th century. So there's been some evidence since even the 1980s of warmer conditions in the early Holocene over Greenland. And some of the things we've known for quite a while is that there was open water off of North Greenland for part of this time period in a place where today there is perennial sea ice, and we actually refer to this as the last ice area. This is believed to be the last part of the edge of the Arctic Ocean that would still have ice in summer in a warming climate. And it did lose ice for some part of the early Holocene. There's evidence that plant species and animal species migrated well north of their current ranges around Greenland. There's evidence for melt at the summit of Agassiz ice cap on Ellesmere Island and the summit of the Greenland ice sheet, more frequent than we see today. And there are a bunch of glaciers and ice caps in this region that are present today that we know were gone for some part of the early to middle Holocene. So lots of evidence for a really different environment. And if you've generally learned that the Holocene is a period of stable climate, that's true in a relative sense, but in the Arctic, we kind of have to throw that idea out the window, because these are big climate and environmental changes all happening within the Holocene, largely because of this solar insolation forcing, that you see here, as well as any feedbacks that amplified that. The Greenland ice sheet was also smaller than it is today for some part of this warm period in the Holocene. But one thing that we really haven't known is how warm was this period? What kind of warmth actually drove these profound environmental changes? And you might think that in Greenland, we're better situated to know paleo temperatures than just about anywhere else, because we have these iconic ice core records right from the Greenland ice sheet, and a couple of different temperature proxies in delta 18 of ice, and also in nitrogen isotopes in the ice. But it turns out there are a couple of fundamental problems with trying to see Holocene temperature changes in these iconic ice core temperature records. One is that it's summer insolation that's driving so much of the climate change that we see expressed in ice and species responses. And those responses are probably sensitive to summer temperature change. So we think that due to the forcing, and also we infer from what proxies we see changes in, that most of the warmth of the early Holocene was strongly expressed in summer. Ice cores integrate across the year, so their precipitation from across the year in the oxygen isotopes, and the nitrogen isotope proxy integrates across the year as well. So we can't see summer versus winter in temperature. And so whatever's going on with winter sort of smooths out what's going on with summer. There's that. And also, kind of even more problematic for the Holocene, there's a significant change in the elevation of the ice sheet surface from the early Holocene to the late Holocene. And the ice sheet surface at summit was higher. We don't know by how much, but it was higher in the early Holocene than it is now. So that ice sheet surface bumped up into higher elevations. That creates a colder local climate at a time when maybe regional climate was warmer, but that higher elevation masks the warming that we would otherwise see in the ice core proxies. So unfortunately, we have these beautiful paleo temperature reconstructions from the ice sheet, and they're really not useful for quantifying summer temperature changes through the Holocene. So of course, as I'm a paleolimnologist, I'm going to turn to lake sediments to solve this problem. And in particular, I want to give you a really quick, 4-slide overview of a paper that I put together in 2021 with Anne Vernal, who's a paleooceanographer, and Eric Osterberg, who's a glaciochemist, where we created a review of all the paleo temperature reconstructions from around Greenland, from lake sediments, from ocean sediments, and from ice. But to get at summer air temperatures, which ultimately are also the climate parameter the temperature parameter that's going to matter to ice sheet mass balance, summer air temperatures around the margins in the Appalachian zone of the ice sheet. To get at that, we're going to end up looking at lake-derived records because that's what exists for air temperature reconstructions of summer around Greenland. We compiled everything that's at least 7,000 years long and found that almost all of these records of summer temperature for Greenland, these long records, come from either pollen or insect, aka midge species assemblages. And there are a couple that come from reconstructions of delta 18 of precipitation. So that's what we have to work with to reconstruct summer temperatures around the margins of Greenland through the Holocene. And in case there are folks who don't work in the paleo realm and haven't seen a lot of paleoclimate talks, just very briefly, pollen and midge-based temperature reconstructions are based on species assemblages and essentially looking at what I'm representing in the top panel here, looking at shifts in percentages of one species versus another and combinations of species versus others over time, comparing that with what we know about modern distribution of species relative to a climate variable, in this case, summer air temperature, and then using various statistical models to then infer model summer temperatures from the paleo fossil assemblage data over time. And for both pollen and midges, the use of this method is, I think, really well justified in Greenland. There's a lot of calibration data, some from Greenland itself, which aren't showing up in this slide, but even more so from surrounding land masses where we have very similar ecosystems and climate zones. And those places just happen to be more accessible for sampling. And there's strong relationships between summer temperatures and species distributions of both midges and plants in these places. Doesn't mean these proxies are perfect by any stretch, as you will see, but there's strong rationale for using these to reconstruct paleo temperatures. So what I want to do now is really race through the approach that we used to reconstruct summer air temperatures in this paper. And then go straight to the punchline of what we think happened with temperatures through the Holocene. So our approach involved pulling together all of the kind of direct and indirect evidence we could for summer temperatures in different regions of Greenland. And I'm going to show you on this slide as I build it out, all the evidence we could find published for the northwest part of Greenland. And we're starting with a couple data sets from the Agassiz ice cap, which is not on Greenland, it's on adjacent Ellesmere Island, but it's a beautiful paleo record, and I couldn't resist including it because it tells us something about regional climate. And in particular, what we see is that a couple different proxies that tell us about temperature, melt and delta 18, both indicate peak temperatures in the early part of the Holocene. So the early Holocene is going to be highlighted yellow in this figure. Peak temperatures in the early Holocene and then cooling throughout the Holocene in both of these proxies. Here's some complementary evidence. So the orange bar is representing a local ice cap in Northwest Greenland that I studied and some grad students studied with Meredith Kelly at Dartmouth. And we found that that ice cap was smaller than it is today for most of the Holocene, the entire time represented by that orange bar. And only very recently did it grow to its present size. Boreal beetles and fish. So the boreal, there is the closest modern range for these species is in the far south of Greenland today, really far from this region, are found in a lake in Greenland around 8,000 years ago. Now I'm adding the quantitative proxies. Summer temperature reconstructions from pollen, midges, and the delta 18 reconstruction. And I'd like you to look at that maroon line, the midges from a lake called Deltaso to start. That tells a story that agrees really well, I think, with the ice cores and the complementary evidence in those colored bars. Peak temperatures in the early Holocene, quite warm, 2-3 degrees warmer than pre-industrial late Holocene. The delta 18 record starts later, but agrees quite well again with the idea of dramatic cooling through the middle and late Holocene, and might suggest even kind of warmer peak temperatures than the midges. But all these things so far agree quite well. Then we get to the pollen-based reconstructions, which are shown as dashed lines. And I was surprised to see this, but they really don't agree with any of the other evidence. And in fact, the pollen from Lungus, also known as the Greenland, is from the very same lake as the boreal beetles and fish, shown as the green bar in the panel below. So those are from the same lake. And when we see these fish and beetles that today live only far south of the site in this lake, the pollen reconstruction from that lake does not suggest warm temperatures. It suggests temperatures quite a bit cooler than today. So in summary, what we conclude from this region is that overall there's evidence for really strong warmth in the early Holocene and then gradual cooling throughout the Holocene. And there's something up with the pollen that I won't go into detail about, but I'm happy to discuss after. We think that this is something to do with either a long migration and establishment time for plants to get back up to the north of Greenland after a glaciation that, ice covered all of northern North America, essentially. Or it might be a no analog climate that just is not providing a solid reconstruction of temperature for that reason. And we see that pattern in multiple sectors of Greenland, where pollen disagrees with all the other evidence, and all the other evidence is internally consistent with each other. So skipping right to the sort of temperature punchline here, doing that exercise in multiple quadrants of Greenland, we came up with these conclusions about air temperatures through the Holocene. And they're kind of well represented by a couple time slices. And essentially what we found is that there's a couple different versions of the Holocene thermal maximum in Greenland. There's an early Holocene version and a middle Holocene version, and they're fundamentally different. In the early Holocene, we had the strongest summer insolation forcing, and we had really warm temperatures over a lot of Greenland, 3 to 5 degrees C warmer, we think, than mid-20th century. But then in southern Greenland, we don't see that warming. And we think that has to do with some interesting stuff going on in the Labrador Sea as a result of meltwater from the decaying Laurentide ice sheet, which there's still a lot of Laurentide ice sticking around. In the middle Holocene, in contrast, we see the ocean start to behave a lot more like it does today, probably because that residual Laurentide ice sheet is essentially gone. It looks a lot like modern. You're not hosing the North Atlantic with fresh water, and you have a moderate summer insolation anomaly that's just driving widespread warmth across Greenland, kind of throughout the seasons, especially during summer though, but it's more moderate warmth. But that's the big picture. Think sort of 3 to 5 degrees C of cooling through the Holocene on that multi-millennial time scale. For the rest of the talk, I want to answer 2 questions. One, did Greenland's glaciers and ice caps beyond the ice sheet survive that warmth of the early to middle Holocene? And my third question, how did that warmth affect lakes and ultimately carbon cycling? So to answer our question about mountain glaciers and ice caps, I'm going to turn to the work of PhD student Laura LaRocca, who actually worked with Jeremy Brooks, and he contributed to some of the work I'll show. Laura is now an assistant professor at Arizona State University, by the way. She'll be accepting graduate students soon. So keep an eye out for you or any of your graduating students. Last fall, Laura had a study come out that's actually looking at present day change in Greenland's thousands of ice caps and mountain glaciers beyond the ice sheet. And she used aerial photographs like these to quantify rates of glacier retreat throughout the 20th century. And skipping to the punchline, what she found is shown here. So you're seeing frontal rate changes that in all time slices and all regions of Greenland throughout this graph are negative, which means all of these time slices are recording retreat of ice fronts. But the rate of retreat, after in some places being quite fast at the end of a little ice age in the early 20th century, slowed way down. So retreat was still happening in the mid-20th century, but it slowed way down. And then since the year 2000 has doubled or more, depending on what region you're in. So retreat has accelerated dramatically all across Greenland. Her study looked at more than 1,000 mountain glaciers and ice caps that are we think pretty representative of Greenland's tens of thousands of mountain glaciers and ice caps. So these glaciers are in rapid retreat. What can we say about how they fared during the Holocene thermal maximum? 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 degrees warmer than mid-20th century. Turns out we can't answer that question very well at all with traditional glacial geologic methods, because reconstructing periods of smaller glacial extent is notoriously hard, because present-day glaciers cover any evidence that's there and tend to scour away any evidence that was there beneath their beds. But we can use lakes to fill this gap. And that's because lakes with glaciers in their watersheds, like the one with the turquoise or the orange circle around them, those lakes are receiving big inputs of mineral material from the wet-based glaciers in their watersheds. So rock flour is kind of swamping out light penetration in the waters of those lakes. They're so turbid that they don't have much of an ecosystem. Very few photosynthesizers can thrive in these turbid lakes. And so you can picture the sediments that are sinking to the bottoms of those lakes and accumulating are mostly mineral material that's derived from glacial erosion. In contrast, that lake that's circled in white is a clear water lake. There's no glacier in its watershed today. So light is penetrating deep into that presumably low productivity lake and feeding a thriving ecosystem. The sediments that are deposited in that lake today would be organic rich, made of biogenic and organic materials, predominantly brown, and loaded with insect bits and plant bits. So just to make sure that you're paying attention, you can quiz yourself. Can you spot the transition from glacier in the watershed to no glacier in the watershed in these sediment cores from a Greenland lake? You probably did. So the left end of each of these cores, you can see those arrows. The arrows are pointing up. The left end of each of these cores is present day. And so we know, just looking through these core tubes, that as you go back through this lake's past, you go through many years when there is a glacier in the lake's watershed, just like today, but you get back to a time when there was no glacier in the lake's watershed and organic sediments are being deposited. We actually can find these really clear binary signals in a lot of lakes, because any glacial fluvial input or glacial input into a lake just adds so much sediment to the system. And these ecosystems are exquisitely sensitive to light availability. You get a very binary signal in a lot of these lakes. So Laura went to some of these lakes in South Greenland that have quite small mountain glaciers and ice caps in their watershed, took a course to see if back in the past there were time periods when these glaciers were not there. And the water in this lake, for example, would have not had that beautiful turquoise color. And this is an example of one of her records. You can see right away that she did recover core from this lake that contained brown organic rich sediments in the middle of the core. Those sediments also contain nice plant material for radiocarbon dating. And then on either side, below and above, sediments are gray. They contain very little organic material, and we can also use magnetic susceptibility, shown here as MS, and titanium abundance to infer the amount of mineral material in the sediments, and it's very low during the brown phase of sedimentation, that organic phase. So very little influx of rock flour during that period. So Laura infers from this that the little glacier that's upstream of this lake was absent from about 5,200 to 1,400 years ago. And people have actually used this approach at many lakes around the margins of Greenland and across the Arctic more broadly. It's really our best way to get at reconstructing smaller versions of today's glaciers and ice caps. And Laura summarized all of these types of records from around Greenland as part of this thesis chapter. And what you see here is, let's see, solid gray tells you that we know from a lake record that the present day glacier was absent. The hatched gray or turquoise colors tell you that we know ice was at least smaller than today. And maybe we can't always say whether the ice was completely gone, but it had to be smaller to exit the lake's watershed. And then the solid turquoise color tells us the glacier that's putting sediments into the lake today was doing so throughout the length of those turquoise bars. In short, what we learned from this is that many of today's glaciers were smaller, or in a lot of cases, completely absent in the early to middle Holocene. And the corollary, as you go left on the diagram and kind of look for the start of that turquoise bar, is we can also say when today's mountain glaciers, as we know them, formed. And most are thousands of years old. So these are glaciers that today are in rapid retreat. So I want to move on to my final question. How does warming climate affect the lakes themselves? And then I'm going to relate that to aspects of carbon cycling, because lakes do a lot of carbon cycling. And I feel like I'm going to be on strong ground talking about lake mixing and stratification to folks in Madison, because you have such strengths in limnology up there, and you all know your local lakes so well that I think probably Madison is the town in the country where more people know about lake stratification as percent than probably anywhere. But if this is not a familiar concept, I'll say a couple of things. One, that mixing regime or stratification regime is kind of one of the most fundamental ways that we divide up lakes. It's a really, really important characteristic of a lake that helps determine what lake ecosystems look like and biogeochemical cycling and so on. There's a lot that's downstream of a lake's mixing regime. Your lakes in Madison are intensively monitored. I'm sure you can find out when the lake mixes and when it stratifies on a seasonal basis because of lots of monitoring that's happening. In Greenland, very few lakes are monitored, and very few have even had temperature loggers put down to check temperature versus depth. So we don't know that much about mixing regimes of lakes in Greenland, but I thought this was a really interesting study, not by my group, by Cadeau et al., that compared temperature profiles in several lakes in West Greenland. This is near Kangerlussuaq, which is kind of the easiest place to get to in Greenland as a foreign scientist, big airstrip there. It's comparing temperature profiles versus depth in a summer of normal temperatures, 2013, those are the blue dash lines, with 2012, which was a record warm year in a lot of places, including Greenland. So summer in 2012 was 2 degrees warmer than typical. And you can see that in the blue year, the normal year, some of these lakes are barely stratified. There's some stratification that's developed in some, but it's a lot weaker than what we see in that warmer year. So a couple degrees warmer summer yields quite a different type of stratification or intensity of stratification in these lakes, which suggests that these lakes, which sit in the part of Greenland that has the warmest summers today, they sit kind of on a line where if summers were a bit cooler, maybe you'd have very little stratification and wind mixing would win the battle. Whereas if summers were a bit warmer, like a couple degrees warmer, you start to get strong summer thermal stratification, which fundamentally alters a lot of things about what's going on in the lake. And indeed, there's a prediction, this is a modeling study, that shows a prediction that future warming will intensify stratification in lakes in a lot of places. This is a summer thermal stratification. And you see that hot spot over the high Arctic, where there's a almost doubling of the duration of stratification, potential stratification in those high Arctic lakes. So this would be a really fundamental change in Arctic lake ecosystems. We care for local reasons that I'll briefly touch on in just a moment. We also care because carbon cycling within lakes is partly set by mixing regime and by stratification. And that's partly because lakes that are strongly thermally stratified in summer tend to develop anoxic bottom waters. And those anoxic conditions promote formation of methane, which of course is a very potent greenhouse gas. So one reason to care about changes in lake stratification has to do with carbon cycling in lakes. And this is not an area where I've done research in the past. One graduate student's PhD work is just kind of taking both of us in that direction, dragging us there because of some surprising results that we got in a paleolimnological study. So I want to share those surprising results. I think they're really cool. This is work that was led by Jamie McFarland, who's the former PhD student on the left. She is an assistant professor at the University of Wyoming now, also recruiting graduate students to work on biogeochemistry questions in Arctic lakes and paleoclimate questions in a lot of different places. She did her PhD with me and also with Maggie Osborne, who's the geobiologist here at Northwestern. Some of you may know her. So I'm going to show you for the next set of slides, mostly data from this lake, Lake Trifnisø in northeast Greenland. So it's way up in the high Arctic of northeast Greenland. And probably some stuff about this landscape jumps out at you. Maybe first and foremost, the barrenness of the terrestrial landscape. This is a similar climate zone. So this is another lake in our study that's in northwest Greenland. It's the star over there in northwest Greenland. And again, like in this more close-up view, you can see there's not a ton of terrestrial vegetation. There's grasses and herbs poking up here and there. But actually, the dominant vegetation in this image is on the bottom of the lake. So you see that dark bluish green blob in the middle of the lake. That dark color is coming from a moss mat that covers the bottom of the lake. So there are these mosses called brown mosses that are very common, covering the bottoms of mid to high Arctic lakes. And in these systems, they tend to be the dominant plant biomass in the landscape. So if you send something like an Ekman dredge down to the bottom of the lake, whatever you send down to the bottom of the lake, it comes back up covered in this moss. It's kind of an annoying, hairy problem if you're trying to get at something else. But it also screams, study me, I'm important. I'm a big part of this landscape. And it's beautiful up close too, as you see in that middle image. And it becomes a really dominant macrofossil in the sediments of these types of lake systems. And we also think it should be a very dominant source of biomarkers, molecular organic material to the sediments as well. In particular, Maggie and Jamie study a class of organic biomarkers called leaf waxes that many of you know if you work in paleoclimate. The most common use of leaf waxes in paleoclimate studies is to look at so-called long chain leaf waxes, C29s or C27s and higher, which mostly come from terrestrial plants. But mid-chains, shorter N-alkanes and N-alkanoic acids, are typically presumed to come from aquatic plants and non-vascular plants. So things like these aquatic brown mosses. And where these aquatic brown mosses are so dominant, we're quite confident that mid-chain leaf waxes that we find in those sediments are going to have come from aquatic mosses. if you just focus that these are gonna be my most complicated data figures, but focus on the upper left for now. And I just want to explain to those of you who haven't used this proxy that, again, long chains, C27s, and especially longer chains than that, we presume come from terrestrial plants in the landscape. And there's enough of those to yield enough to measure in the sediments. And here we're looking at hydrogen isotopes in blue in those terrestrial plant leaf waxes. And a big body of prior work tells us that the hydrogen isotopes of long chain terrestrial plant leaf waxes tell us about the hydrogen isotopes of the water that those plants were using from their soils. And in this environment, that equates to precipitation. And in many environments, people use C29 leaf wax hydrogen isotopes to reconstruct precipitation hydrogen isotopes. So think of that upper blue line as our reconstruction of local precipitation isotopes through the Holocene. And now compare it with the bottom panel that shows ice core delta 18, the other isotope of water, but turns out these two reconstructions, or really three, because there's a couple different ice cores there, agree really well with one another. So we think we have a nice reconstruction of precipitation isotopes, and all of these reconstructions of precipitation isotopes basically follow the path of what we think temperature did through the Holocene, which is not a surprise. So all of that seems really well behaved. Now we get to our moss leaf waxes. The mosses are living in the lake water, so our plan was to use moss leaf wax hydrogen isotopes to reconstruct lake water stable isotopes over time. And that should look a lot like precipitation, but maybe with a little bit of overprinting from evaporation. We weren't sure. In reality, it looks absolutely nothing like precipitation in the early to middle Holocene. Looks a lot like precipitation in the late Holocene. So what the heck's going on? This is not the signal we expected to see, and it's actually a shocking signal in a couple of ways. One, because it deviates so much from precipitation, and in the wrong direction. Evaporation would tend to make the orange lines go up and be isotopically heavier than precipitation. We don't really know a mechanism, a way to mess with the water cycle that would make this water so depleted, this lake water. And to make matters even worse, you can't even say, well, what if it was all snowfall that was filling up the lake at that time, and you just have really isotopically light precipitation at that time because somehow only winter snowfall is filling the lake and not summer rain. Because this gray bar is showing you the full isotopic range of precipitation over Northwest Greenland today. And it's a huge range. It's a very seasonal climate. So this is a much bigger seasonal range of isotopes precipitation than you would see almost anywhere else. But it's nowhere near enough to explain how light the hydrogen isotopes are in those mosses, those moss leaf waxes in the middle Holocene. So we have this funky, funky mystery. And a surprise. And there is really only one plausible source of very isotopically light hydrogen in a lake, and that's methane. So we started to wonder if methane could somehow be providing some of the hydrogen to these mosses. And we looked at some other proxies and found evidence that that may indeed be the case. So over here, you're seeing the same isotope data in the top right panel. Below that is carbon isotopes in the mid-chain waxes, which also show a big excursion. So the carbon is really light too, which also is consistent with methane as a source. Whereas in the bottom right panel, you're seeing the carbon isotopes of the long chain waxes from the terrestrial plants, and they don't have that kind of excursion. They're just pretty boring, as we would expect. And then there are two GDGT biomarkers, one from bacteria, one from archaea, that were both very consistent with low oxygen conditions and methanogenesis during the exact same period where we had these really depleted hydrogen isotopes. So we think that Jamie's study is the first ever to show evidence that hydrogen from methane can make its way into leaf waxes. and create these extreme depletions. And what's more, and I think this is maybe my final data slide, it's not just at this one lake, Trifnacell. So Jamie's study developed new leaf wax records for two northern lakes, Trifnacell and WLL, the lake in northwest Greenland, the top panel here, and also looked for any other published records with the same types of leaf waxes from Greenland, just the same chain lengths. And she found a couple other lakes in West Greenland. So she looked at those two and found that in 3 of these 4 lakes, Trifnacell plus 2 of the 3 you see here, moss waxes, mid-chain waxes, are extremely isotopically depleted in the early to middle Holocene when climate was warmer. These are widespread parts of Greenland. They're different climate zones. This is kind of like saying you're seeing the same phenomenon in Wyoming that you're seeing in, I don't know, probably like Tennessee or something. These are really different climate zones spread far apart. What it's starting to look like is that over a huge swath of Greenland, lakes developed anoxic conditions during the Holocene thermal maximum that were unique to that warmer time period and driven by warming. The bottom panel lake is really shallow compared to the others, and we think it just didn't stratify because it was so shallow. So to wrap up, a final point here about lakes. Carbon cycling matters to the whole world, but how stratification changes in a warming climate might prove to matter a lot to local people in Greenland as well. 33 of Greenland's 52 rural settlements, so this is beyond the few towns that are considered cities and towns, source their household water from lakes. It's the predominant source of household water in rural Greenland. So water quality and quantity in Greenland's lakes really matters to people there. And current graduate students are very aware of this and starting to work on what we hope is some societally relevant research, looking at lakes near communities that depend on lakes for their water. Mia Tusilo on the left brought the paper I just showed you a figure from to my attention. And she is going to be going to Greenland this summer to look at changes in water quality in Greenland lakes near a lake-dependent community through the Holocene this summer. And Bailey Nash on the right will be her field assistant this summer. Bailey is also working herself on understanding how water quantity and lake level changes in some of the drier parts of Greenland with potential real relevance to water supply lakes. So just to wrap up, take-homes, paleolimnology fills a really important gap in reconstructing temperatures around the margins of Greenland in summer. Ice cores just don't get us there, unfortunately. Many of Greenland's glaciers and ice caps, which generally are thousands of years old, are likely to disappear under future warming scenarios. They disappeared in the early middle Holocene. And Greenland lake mixing and carbon cycling might change dramatically in warmer climates. And that's kind of a light bulb that's gone off recently, thanks to my graduate students' work there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk. I think maybe you'll get the virtual applause for that. It was really nice. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'm going to open it up to questions. So please either add a question to the chat. I've not been monitoring that, so I guess nope, it doesn't look like there are any questions there yet. Or of course, I don't know if you have the option to unmute yourself or not. I believe that everyone does. So are there any questions that people would like to ask? Either just raising your hand.
I have a brief question. So how do you make sense of this conflicting information about midges and pollen with the early Holocene, and I guess how that might be relevant today?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question that I unfortunately don't know the answer to, but I can say that I've looked at it across the Arctic, and it seems to be a similar problem across much of the high latitude Arctic. Might be worse at highest latitudes, which might be a clue as to what's going on. But I think we need to understand the spatial pattern and which sites are the places where the problem is the worst, to start to understand the cause. There's certainly potential for no analog climates in the early Holocene in the Arctic, because you have this strong positive summer insolation anomaly and a negative winter insolation anomaly. So there's some evidence that winters might have been colder than present. We don't have a lot of winter proxies, but there's some evidence for that. So seasonality may have been really, really intense, and we don't really know what that would look like for plants, but it's something that I bet a plant person could model and try to figure out. I personally find it hard to imagine that it takes that many thousands of years for sort of this like pioneering high Arctic vegetation to make its way up there and establish itself. So I don't really like the idea that it's a colonization lag, but I'm not really a plant person, so I'd love other thoughts about that.
Thank you.
If it really does take that long, then maybe our concerns about positive warming feedbacks from vegetation migration, maybe that feedback's slower than we thought it might be, but I doubt that that's the case.
Great, thanks for the question. Are there other questions?
Hey, I can ask a question. In comparison to some of the warming you were looking at in the early Holocene, but relevant to some of the carbon cycling you were speaking about at the end, are some of the lakes today close to some kind of tipping point where the bottoms might start going anoxic?
I think we don't know for sure, but I would speculate based on that study that I showed the year that's a couple degrees warmer in summer kicks the lakes into a regime of clearly stronger thermal stratification. I'd speculate that there may be a lot of lakes that are sitting near a threshold like that. We thought we maybe in Trifnasow, the lake where I showed most of the paleo data for that study, the very top of those cores, we start to see hints that some of those indicators of anoxia are actually kicking in. So originally in that paper, we even said, like, it looks like this lake is starting to do this now, just in the last 50 years, but the evidence is just not really strong enough. So, and reviewers did not find it strong enough, so we took it out. And I think that was the right thing to do, but I really wish we could go instrument a bunch of these high Arctic lakes and see what's going on.
Thanks. Really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you so much. I
Very
see
good.
Andrew.
Thanks.
Hey, Yarrow. Yeah, great talk. That was super interesting. In some of, I guess I want to ask about the glacial sedimentation in lakes. Yeah, in some of my work, I've just seen maybe some disagreement, between the signal of, glacier appearance, disappearance, and it being maybe more difficult to parse out than we thought. Could you just speak to maybe some complexities in that work and how confident you are in those results?
I think it is it's nice to be using that method to look at broad multi-millennial scale changes in glacier presence absence, and not to be in the position of trying to parse what happened within a given 500-year period with a glacier, because there's all these questions about remobilization of sediment, and does a glacier spit out more sediment when it's big or when it's retreating, and there's a lot of nuance in there, and I suspect there's other information we could tease out from the data that we have, but I like looking at it in this very coarse way where we know there's a phase where we have a thriving aquatic photosynthetic ecosystem and very little mineral material. And we know there's a phase where there's the opposite of that. And I feel really confident that you have to have a glacier in the watershed for thousands of years to create thousands of years of mineral material and nolite. And you can't have a glacier in the watershed for the opposite. And then it's that, I'd say it's those periods of transition that would be harder to parse. Does that align with your understanding of it?
Yeah, no, I mean that works for me. Yeah, I sometimes think of other ways where, like meltwater routing somewhere, maybe the moraine is trapping some sediments. I mean, who knows? I don't know.
Yeah,
But
weird stuff could definitely happen, and there could well be in that list of 15 lakes. Maybe there's a couple where something a little different than the straightforward story we're imagining is really the story. I think the power starts to come in the regional picture, and Laura did a chapter that summarized all these records from across the entire Arctic. I think it was 66 lakes or something like that, and there's just really strong regional patterns that come out of that.
great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
There's a question on the chat. I don't know if you can see that or not, otherwise I can read it.
Yes, I see. What was the lifespan of animals in the Holocene compared to today's warm period? Also, how extent was the migration? I'm not sure about like what the first part of the question is quite wanting me to address, but I think like one nice thing about the Holocene when you use biologic indicators as your proxies is that for the most part we assume there's not large amounts of evolutionary change in species, and so we kind of assume that we're dealing with species that behaved and had physiology very much like modern day. And so we kind of assume a chironomid that liked given conditions today, the thing that looks just like it in the sediment record liked the same environmental conditions and would have had the same lifespan and all that. So we assume a kind of biological stability in species autoecology. Now that's not always entirely correct, but that's an assumption. The migration of plants that needed to happen to get up to North Greenland, we basically extirpated most plants from northern North America, really. There may have been some little refugia, and there's debates about whether there were little mountain ranges that poked up and a few little really hardy Arctic species might have survived there, but there's not much evidence for refugia in Greenland or Arctic Canada. So really, a lot of species had to migrate from basically from mainland Europe, and probably what today is sort of southern and central Europe, or from Illinois and New Jersey. And then
I just had a logistical question for someone. When can we expect to get the recording of this meeting, or where could we access it?
That is a very good question for
I
Alessandra.
can answer that. Yeah, so I'll have this uploaded on the CCR YouTube channel, that's Center for Climatic Research. So if you go to the CCR website, there should be a link there where you can access it within the next week.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yep.
Great questions, everyone. Thank you. We may have time for one more question if there is one. Okay, well, not seeing any immediately. Yes, please feel free to go review that. That'll be online. But thank you very much for the presentation today, and thank you for joining us virtually and making this work out. And very nice audience. Thanks to everyone for coming today and for the questions that you posed. And so really appreciate it. And thanks for sharing with us so much.
thanks, everybody. I hope
All
to
right.
see you in person in the future.
Yeah. Please
Nice
come up
to
north
meet you.
anytime you like. We'd be happy to have you here.
Love to. Take care.
Take care. Thank you.